There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a body settling into sleep beside you. You don't recognize them as watersheds at the time. There is no thunderclap, no sudden, cinematic swell of music. There is only the subtle shift of air in a room, the almost imperceptible change in the rhythm of a person's breathing. And it's only later, when you trace the map of your life backward, that you see it, the precise coordinate where the entire landscape of your future was redrawn. For me, that moment was not a single point, but a series of them, a constellation of quiet evenings that glittered with a terrifying, unspoken hope. It was the feeling of Julian's breath against the back of my neck in the shared dark of my bedroom, a silent question I was too afraid to answer and too desperate to ignore. Tonight was another of those moments. He was asleep on my couch, a place that had become more his than mine in recent months. The television murmured on, casting flickering blue and gold light across his face, sculpting shadows under his cheekbones and catching in the dark sweep of his lashes. He had arrived 3 hours ago, not with a declaration of distress, but with the quiet exhaustion that had become his tell. He dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the clatter a familiar announcement of his surrender to the day. He didn't speak of the client he was losing or the pressure that was visibly hollowing him out. He just sank onto the sofa, pulled a throw blanket over his legs, and looked at me with an expression that said, simply, "Let me stay." I had, of course, let him. I always did. Now, in the deep-sea quiet of the apartment, he had shifted in his sleep, his head lolling from the arm of the couch to my lap, a migration as natural and unconscious as a tide turning. One of his hands, which had been resting on his own chest, had uncurled and draped itself across my thigh, his fingers limp and warm against the worn denim of my jeans. My entire body had frozen. It was a cartography of touch I had spent years memorizing in theory, but had never dared to experience in practice. The gentle, possessive pressure was a brand, a claim. In the logic of sleep, it meant nothing. It was a random spasm of muscle, a search for comfort. But in the frantic, over-caffeinated logic of my own mind, it was everything. It was a confession whispered in a language of nerve endings and body heat, a language I was fluent in but had never been allowed to speak. I sat there, a statue carved from hope and fear, my breath caught in my throat, listening to the sound of his sleep and wondering if a life could be built or broken in the space of a single, unconscious touch. Our story didn't begin in the charged silence of my living room. It began under the deafening, chlorinated echo of a natatorium, a decade earlier. I met Julian our freshman year of college, both of us unlikely additions to the university swim team. He was a supernova of raw talent and effortless charisma, a sprinter who cut through the water with a furious grace that left everyone, including the coach, breathless. His laughter was the loudest thing in the locker room, his energy a magnetic force that pulled the entire team into his orbit. He was all golden skin, sun-bleached hair, and a smile that could disarm armies. I, on the other hand, was a distance swimmer built for endurance, not explosion. My presence was quieter, my path through the water a steady, meditative rhythm rather than a triumphant splash. I was the observer, the one who saw the subtle cracks in the team's bravado, the flicker of doubt in a teammate's eye before a big race. My real passion wasn't the swimming itself, but capturing it. I had my father's old film camera with me always, and I became the team's unofficial documentarian, my lens finding the poetry in the strained muscle of a shoulder, the explosion of water droplets from a flip turn, the shared, exhausted camaraderie on the pool deck. Julian, for all his boisterous popularity, was the first one to truly see what I was doing. He didn't just glance at the prints I pinned to the corkboard, he studied them. One afternoon, long after practice had ended and the pool had fallen silent, I found him standing in front of a photo I'd taken of him the week before. It wasn't a victory shot. It was a picture of him sitting on the edge of the pool, head in his hands, the water slicking his hair back, his body coiled with a tension that was invisible to everyone else. The fluorescent lights of the natatorium cast a lonely, sterile glow around him. He looked isolated, the weight of expectation a physical thing pressing down on his shoulders. I had almost not put it up, feeling it was too private, too revealing. He heard me approach and didn't turn around. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual performative cheer. "You see things," he said, his finger hovering just over the glossy surface of the print. "You see the part everyone else misses." That was the beginning. It was the opening of a door I hadn't even realized was closed. Our friendship was forged in the quiet hours after the world had gone to sleep. Julian, it turned out, was a terrible procrastinator, his days so filled with social obligations and athletic demands that his academic life was a constant, frantic game of catch-up. He'd appear at my dorm room door at midnight, a stack of books in his arms and a desperate look in his eyes, smelling of chlorine and the cheap pizza he'd eaten for dinner. My room was an oasis of calm, my desk always organized, my work methodical. He would collapse onto my spare chair, run a hand through his damp hair, and sigh. He said my quiet focus helped him think. In truth, he did most of the talking. He'd talk about the pressure to win, the bewildering expectations of his parents, the confusing, fleeting romances he kept stumbling into and out of. I became his confessor, his anchor. I listened, offering quiet counterpoints to his anxieties, organizing his chaotic notes, making him coffee when his eyes started to droop. In those late-night hours, the brilliant, confident Julian everyone else saw would peel away, revealing someone younger, more uncertain, and profoundly lonely. And I, against all my better judgment, fell in love with that version of him. It wasn't a sudden fall. It was a slow, gentle erosion of my defenses. It was in the way he'd smile when I handed him a mug of coffee, a small, genuine smile that didn't reach his eyes but settled somewhere deeper, in a place of pure gratitude. It was in the way he'd absent-mindedly tap his fingers against my arm to get my attention, a casual touch that would send a jolt through my entire system. I knew, with a certainty that was both a comfort and a torment, that his affection for me was purely platonic. I was his safe harbor, his brother-in-arms, the one person who demanded nothing from him. To him, I was Leo, the steady, reliable friend. To me, he was the sun, and I was a planet caught in his orbit, content to circle him in the dark, drawing warmth from a distance, terrified of ever getting close enough to burn. So I built walls. I constructed an elaborate fortress of self-preservation around my heart. I dated, or pretended to. I listened patiently as he talked about the girls he was seeing, offering bland, supportive advice while my own feelings churned like a toxic sea inside me. I perfected the art of the supportive friend, a role I played with Oscar-worthy dedication, because the alternative, confessing my feelings and watching our friendship shatter into a million irreparable pieces, was simply unthinkable. The friendship was the most important thing I had. I would not be the one to destroy it. I would be the quiet observer, forever. After college, our lives diverged and then, miraculously, converged again. Julian was headhunted by a top software firm, his brilliant mind, once applied to hydrodynamics, now tasked with untangling complex code for corporate clients. The job sent him flying across the country, living out of sterile hotel rooms and navigating the high-stakes pressure of boardroom presentations. He wore his success like a well-tailored suit, but when he called me from a hotel bar in Chicago or a lonely airport lounge in Atlanta, I could hear the same old exhaustion in his voice, the same thread of loneliness that had run through our late-night study sessions. I, meanwhile, had leaned into my passion, building a modest but fulfilling career as a freelance photographer. I specialized in capturing the quiet, overlooked moments, the way light fell across a worn wooden table, the intimate geometry of clasped hands, the stories told by the lines on a person's face. My life was small, deliberate, and rooted in the city we had both decided to call home. My apartment, a third-floor walk-up with good light and old hardwood floors, became his unofficial base camp, the one place he could land between trips and shed the armor of his corporate life. He had a girlfriend, Clara. They had been together for almost 2 years. On paper, she was perfect. Smart, ambitious, beautiful. She was an architect, someone who, like Julian, dealt in structures and concrete plans. They looked like the perfect couple in photographs, a testament to a life well lived. But whenever Julian spoke of her, there was a subtle dissonance, a note of something hollow. He described their plans, the condo they were looking at, the trip to Italy they were supposed to take, with the detached air of someone reading a script. I saw her a few times, at group dinners or parties. She was perfectly nice, but there was a barrier between them, an invisible wall of politeness that I, with my photographer's eye for emotional nuance, could see as clearly as if it were made of glass. Julian was performing the role of the devoted boyfriend, just as he had performed the role of the confident swim star. I saw the strain it took, the energy it cost him. I never said anything, of course. It wasn't my place. I just kept the coffee hot and the door to my apartment and my friendship open. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle tremor but a seismic event. It was a Tuesday in October, the air outside crisp with the promise of autumn. I was in my darkroom, the red light casting a monastic glow over the trays of chemicals, watching an image of a rain-slicked street slowly materialize on paper. My phone buzzed insistently on the workbench. It was Julian. I almost let it go to voicemail, my hands deep in the fixer, but something in the rapid succession of calls sent a spike of alarm through me. I rinsed my hands, dried them hastily on my jeans, and answered. Leo. His voice was raw, thin, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Julian? What's wrong? Where are you? Can I come over? He asked, and the simple question was freighted with a universe of pain. Something's happened. Of course, I said immediately. Come now. He arrived less than 20 minutes later, but the man who stood on my doorstep was a stranger. The confident, easygoing Julian I knew had been replaced by a ghost. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide and unfocused, like someone who had just walked away from a car crash. He was still in his work clothes, a crisp button-down shirt, now rumpled, and tailored slacks, but he looked as though he had aged a decade since I'd last seen him a week ago. He stepped inside without a word, walked directly to my sofa, and collapsed into it, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders started to shake, and a sound tore from his throat, a dry, ragged sob that seemed to cause him physical pain. It was the sound of a carefully constructed world falling apart. It was the sound of utter defeat. It turned out Clara had ended things. But it was more than that. She hadn't just broken up with him. She had dismantled him. She had told him, with the cool precision of an architect pointing out a structural flaw, that their entire relationship had been a performance. That she knew he was just going through the motions. That he was emotionally absent, a ghost in his own life. She had accused him of being incapable of real connection, of using her as a shield against a loneliness he refused to confront. And to make it all worse, this had happened on the heels of him losing a major account at work, a project he had poured months of his life into. The twin failures, personal and professional, had created a perfect storm, and Julian was at its epicenter, completely adrift. He told me all of this in broken, halting sentences, his voice thick with a shame so profound it was difficult to witness. He wasn't mourning the loss of Clara, not really. He was mourning the loss of the person he was supposed to be. He was confronting the terrifying emptiness she had exposed. I didn't offer platitudes. I didn't say, "You're better off without her," or "You'll find someone else." I knew those words were useless. Instead, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I made him a cup of tea, I sat on the floor in front of the sofa, and I listened. I let his silence and his fragmented sentences fill the space between us. I was his anchor again, the one fixed point in his spinning world. He didn't cry for long. The sobs subsided, replaced by a depleted, hollow quiet. He just sat there, staring at the floor, his hands clenched in his lap. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, he finally looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "I don't want to be alone tonight, Leo," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Can I just stay here? On the couch?" My heart, that foolish, traitorous organ, gave a painful lurch. It was the beginning of the ritual. It was the beginning of everything. That first night set the precedent for what our lives would become over the next 6 months. He slept on my couch, curled under a thick wool blanket, his breathing shallow and fitful. I stayed up late in my armchair, pretending to read, but really, I was just watching over him, a silent sentinel in the dark. The next morning, he left before I woke up, but he left behind a crumpled $20 bill on the counter for the groceries I'd bought and a short text. "Thanks for last night." Really, it was a transaction, a way to keep things from getting too intimate, too dependent. But he was back 2 nights later. And then the night after that. The pretense of him having his own apartment, his own life, began to dissolve. My home became his sanctuary. His keys stayed in the bowl by the door. His spare toothbrush appeared in my bathroom. His work shirts started to accumulate in my laundry basket. It was a slow, creeping invasion, a domesticity we never acknowledged. The couch was the first boundary to blur. For weeks, it was his designated territory. But one night in late November, a cold front had swept through the city, rattling the old windows in my apartment. I found him on the sofa, shivering violently in his sleep, the thin throw blanket offering little comfort. I had a thick down comforter in my bedroom, and without thinking, I went and got it, draping it over him. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with sleep. "You're freezing," I murmured. "Come on. You can't sleep out here." I helped him up, his body pliant and heavy with exhaustion, and led him to my bedroom. It felt like a monumental transgression, leading him into the most private space in my home. I pointed to the bed. "Take it," I said. "I'll take the couch." He shook his head, a stubborn, childlike gesture. "No," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Just stay in the room until I fall asleep." His vulnerability was a blade to the heart. He was afraid of the dark, afraid of the silence, afraid of the nightmares that I knew were plaguing him. He wasn't asking for me. He was asking for a sentry, a warm body to ward off the ghosts. So I stayed. I pulled the armchair from my living room into the corner of my bedroom, brought my book and a reading light, and settled in. The room was filled with the sound of his breathing, which slowly deepened and evened out as he finally succumbed to a peaceful sleep under the warmth of the comforter. I sat there for hours, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way the moonlight from the window traced the curve of his shoulder. It was an intimacy so profound and so painfully one-sided that it felt like I was stealing something. This became the new ritual. He would take my bed, and I would take the chair, a silent guardian in the corner. It was a strange, chaste cohabitation, a performance of intimacy with a clear, established boundary. He was in the bed. I was not. We were together, but we were separate. It was safe. But safety is a fragile illusion. The boundary, like all boundaries, was eventually tested. It happened on a night when a project of my own had kept me up until 3 in the morning. I was bone-tired, my eyes burning from staring at a screen. The thought of sleeping upright in the armchair was unbearable. Julian was already asleep in my bed, a still form under the covers. I looked at the wide, empty expanse of mattress on the other side. My queen-sized bed suddenly seemed as vast as a desert. It would be fine, I told myself. He wouldn't even know. I was just tired. It meant nothing. I slipped under the covers as quietly as I could, my movements slow and deliberate, holding my breath. I lay on the very edge of the mattress, my back to him, my body rigid, a statue of feigned indifference. I could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small distance between us. It was like lying next to a furnace. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve ending firing, my heart hammering against my ribs. Eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and I drifted into a tense, shallow sleep. I woke a few hours later to a profound change in the architecture of the bed. The empty space was gone. In his sleep, Julian had migrated across the mattress, his body now pressed against mine, back to back. His warmth seeped through my t-shirt, a startling, electrifying heat. One of his legs was tangled with mine. It was the casual, unconscious intimacy of a long-term couple. My breath hitched. I lay there, utterly still, terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too loudly, I would break the spell. This was the moment. The ordinary moment where everything changed. He was asleep. It meant nothing, but it meant everything. From that night on, the pretense of the armchair was abandoned. We shared the bed. We never spoke of it. I would get in on my side. He would get in on his, and we would lie in the dark with a careful foot of space between us. But every single night, without fail, I would wake up in the morning to find the space gone, his body curled against mine, his arm thrown over my waist, or his head resting on my shoulder. He was an octopus in his sleep, his limbs seeking an anchor in the dark, and I had become his mooring. I never knew if he was truly asleep when he reached for me, or if it was a deliberate act disguised by the plausible deniability of unconsciousness. I was too afraid to ask. I just accepted this strange, nocturnal affection, hoarding it like a secret treasure. During the day, the spell was broken. We were just friends, We'd make coffee, talk about work, watch movies. The physical intimacy of the night was a ghost that haunted the edges of our interactions, a topic we studiously avoided. He seemed to be getting better. The hollowed-out look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a glimmer of his old self. He started laughing again, real laughs that reached his eyes. And my heart ached with a terrible, soaring hope. I began to document this period, not just for clients, but for myself. I took pictures of him as he slept, the morning light catching the stubble on his jaw, his face peaceful and unguarded in a way it never was when he was awake. They were not creepy. They were acts of devotion. I was trying to capture the truth of him, the vulnerable man I loved, not the polished performer the world saw. I was building a private museum of our unspoken intimacy, a collection of moments that proved it was real, even if it only existed in the dark. But the quiet comfort of our arrangement was a fragile ecosystem, easily disrupted. The disruption came in the form of a party. A mutual friend from college was having a housewarming, and Julian, feeling more like himself, insisted we go. For the first hour, it was fine. It was comfortable. We moved through the crowded rooms as a unit, a familiar pairing. Julian would tell a story, and I would be there to add a dry, witty footnote. It was our old rhythm. But then, a guy I knew vaguely from the art scene, a painter named Marcus, cornered me by the makeshift bar. He was a fan of my work and wanted to talk about a new series of portraits I had on display at a local gallery. He was engaging, intelligent, and, I had to admit, handsome in a rugged, paint-splattered way. We were deep in a conversation about focal lengths and the ethics of documentary photography when I felt a sudden chill in the air. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Julian standing a few feet away, watching us. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was just standing there, a drink held loosely in his hand, his expression completely closed off. The easygoing smile he'd been wearing all night was gone, replaced by a tight, unreadable mask. His eyes, when they met mine, were cold. The shift was immediate and visceral. It was as if a storm front had rolled in, dropping the temperature by 20 degrees. He didn't say anything. He just gave me a curt, almost imperceptible nod and turned away, melting back into the crowd. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I politely excused myself from the conversation with Marcus, my mind racing. What had I done? I found Julian outside on the back porch, staring out at the dark yard. "Hey," I said, my voice tentative. "You okay?" He didn't look at me. He took a long swallow of his drink. "I'm fine," he said, his tone clipped and dismissive. It was the voice he used with annoying clients, a voice that created an immediate and impassable distance. "Just needed some air." "Did something happen?" I pressed gently. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were full of a strange, wounded anger. "Nothing happened, Leo," he said, his voice laced with a bitter irony. "You were just talking to your friend. It's fine." "Marcus? He's just an acquaintance from." "I don't need the details," he cut me off sharply. "It doesn't matter. We're just friends, right? You can do whatever you want." And there it was. We're just friends. He wielded the phrase like a weapon, a shield he could hide behind, while simultaneously stabbing me with it. It was a reminder of my place, a brutal reassertion of the very boundary we had been blurring every single night. It was a punishment. He was jealous. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was jealous, but he couldn't or wouldn't admit it. So he threw our friendship in my face, using it to deny the very emotion that was so clearly written all over his. The rest of the night was a misery of strained silence. He barely spoke to me on the ride home. Back at my apartment, the sanctuary, the air was thick with unspoken resentment. He didn't even make a move toward the bedroom. He just grabbed a blanket, lay down on the couch, and turned his back to me. The message was clear. I had been exiled. I lay awake in my bed alone that night, the empty space beside me colder and larger than it had ever been. The jealousy should have given me hope. It was a sign, wasn't it? A crack in his platonic facade. But all I felt was a profound and aching confusion. He wanted the intimacy, the comfort, the possession, but he refused to name it. He wanted to keep me in this impossible limbo, close enough to touch in the dark, but far enough to deny in the light. This became the new, painful pattern within our ritual. The nights of shared, peaceful sleep would be punctuated by these sudden, inexplicable freezes. It would happen if I took a phone call from a friend and laughed too much. It would happen if I mentioned having lunch with a colleague. Any hint of a life I might have outside of him would trigger this cold withdrawal. He would retreat to the couch, or lie stiffly on the far edge of the bed, a chasm of cold sheets between us. The silence would be punishing, thick with his unacknowledged feelings. And always, if I dared to question it, he would deploy the same devastating line. It's nothing. We're just friends. The phrase became a mantra of our shared dysfunction. It was a denial, a confession, and a cage all at once. I was living in a state of constant emotional whiplash, ricocheting between the tender, unconscious intimacy of our nights and the confusing, painful rejection of his jealousy. I felt like a scientist studying a strange, new weather phenomenon, trying to predict the unpredictable shifts in pressure, the sudden storms that would blow in without warning. I loved him so much it felt like a vital organ, but he was slowly, unintentionally, breaking my heart. I knew something had to give. The foundation of our quiet arrangement was cracking under the strain of everything we refused to say. The breaking point came on a quiet Wednesday night. There was no party, no external catalyst. There was only the accumulated weight of months of unspoken tension. Julian had been particularly distant for 2 days, a chill that had started when I'd mentioned a potential photography gig that would take me out of town for a weekend. The idea of my absence, even a temporary one, had clearly unsettled him. He'd retreated into himself, answering my questions in monosyllables, the warmth between us extinguished. That night, we lay in bed, on our respective sides, the space between us a tangible, throbbing void. The silence in the room was louder than any argument. I couldn't bear it anymore. I was tired of decoding his moods, of walking on eggshells, of living in this gray area of his own making. I was tired of being a safe harbor he only valued when the seas were rough. My own loneliness, the one I had so carefully managed for years, was welling up, threatening to drown me. I lay there, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, rehearsing and discarding 100 different opening lines. Finally, I just turned onto my side to face him. His back was to me, a rigid wall. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet but firm in the darkness. He didn't move, but I knew he was awake. I could tell by the tense set of his shoulders. "I can't do this anymore." He was silent for a long moment. Then, his voice was a low murmur, directed at the wall. "Do what?" "This," I said, the word encompassing everything. "This guessing game. The hot and cold. The way you pull me close, and then push me away the second you remember you're not supposed to want to. The way you punish me for having a life, and then hide behind, 'We're just friends,' like it absolves you of everything." My voice trembled slightly, but I pushed on. "It's not fair. It's not fair to me." He flinched, a small, almost imperceptible tightening of his muscles. He rolled over slowly, his face a pale oval in the dim light filtering through the window. His eyes were wide, and in them, I saw not anger, but a deep, gut-wrenching fear. He looked like a cornered animal. The sight of it almost broke my resolve, but I held his gaze. I had to. For both of us. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, but the denial was weak, flimsy. "Don't you?" I asked softly. "Then why are we in this bed together, Julian? Why have you spent almost every night for the last 6 months here? Why does the thought of me talking to another guy make you look at me like I've just betrayed you?" The questions hung in the air between us, heavy and unavoidable. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as if he wanted to speak but had forgotten how. The silence stretched, taut and electric. I could see the war raging inside him, the conflict between his feelings and the identity he had constructed for himself. I had just torn down all of his defenses, leaving him exposed. He finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper, ragged with a vulnerability I had only ever seen glimpses of before. "I can't sleep," he said, and it wasn't an excuse, it was a confession. "My head. It's so loud all the time. But when I'm here, with you, it's quiet." He took a shaky breath. "And when I see you with someone else, the noise comes back. Only it's worse. And I hate it. I hate feeling that way." He looked down at his hands, which were clenched on top of the comforter. "I don't know what it is, Leo. I don't know what to call it." My own anger dissipated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching tenderness. He wasn't being malicious. He was just lost. He was a man who had spent his entire life following a map, and he had just realized he was in a country that wasn't on it. "Can I?" Ask you something stupid? He whispered, his eyes finally lifting to meet mine again. They were shining with unshed tears. My heart stopped. It felt like the whole world had gone silent, waiting for his next words. Always, I breathed. He hesitated, his gaze searching my face, looking for permission, for reassurance. Would it be okay? He started, his voice cracking on the last word. He swallowed hard and tried again. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question was not a proposition. It was a plea. It was the sound of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, asking if it was safe to jump. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. All the walls I had built around my own heart, the years of self-preservation and cautious observation, crumbled to dust in that single moment. The hope I had been so terrified of, the hope I had tried to starve and suppress, flooded through me, bright and blinding and overwhelming. There was no analysis, no overthinking. There was only a profound, resounding clarity. Yes, I whispered. He didn't search forward. He moved with an agonizing slowness, a hesitation that spoke volumes about the magnitude of this step for him. It gave me 1,000 years to change my mind, to pull back, to reassert the boundaries he had always relied on. I didn't move. I met him halfway, tilting my head just slightly. His lips, when they finally touched mine, were soft and tentative. It wasn't a kiss of passion or pin-up desire. It was a kiss of discovery. It was quiet and gentle and deeply questioning. It tasted of fear and relief and a sorrow for all the time we had lost. In that single, hesitant press of his mouth to mine, all the ambiguity, all the mixed signals and the painful silences were annihilated. It was a confession made in the universal language of touch, a truth we could no longer deny. It was the end of the guessing game. It was the beginning of an answer. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, and we just breathed together in the dark, the space between us no longer a void, but a shared atmosphere. For the first time, the silence in the room wasn't empty. It was full. The morning after was not the cinematic dawn I might have foolishly hoped for. It was fractured and anxious and steeped in the harsh light of reality. I woke up alone. The space beside me in the bed was cold, the indentation of his body already fading from the sheets. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I had dreamed it all, that the kiss had been a phantom of my own desperate imagination. But then I saw it, a single, folded piece of paper on his pillow. My stomach plummeted. I knew, even before I touched it, what it would be. His handwriting, usually so bold and confident, was a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. "Leo, I'm sorry. That was a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. A mistake." The word was a punch to the gut, knocking the air from my lungs. The fragile, beautiful thing we had created in the dark had been shattered by the light of day. He had run. The cowardice of it, the sheer, predictable cowardice, ignited a hot, bitter anger in me. I wasn't just hurt. I was furious. I had made myself vulnerable, had answered his plea with the most honest part of myself, and he had repaid me by calling it a mistake and vanishing. He went dark for 3 days. 3 days of my texts going unanswered, my calls going straight to his voicemail, which was full. The silence from his end was a deafening roar in my small apartment. Every corner of my home was a reminder of him. His forgotten sweatshirt on the back of a chair, his coffee mug sitting by the sink, the ghost of his presence in my bed. The sanctuary had become a prison of memory. The hope that had bloomed so brightly the night of the kiss withered and died, leaving behind a toxic residue of humiliation and rage. I had been a convenience, a warm body, a living sleeping pill. The kiss hadn't been a confession. It had been a moment of weakness, a lapse in his judgment that he now regretted. The thought was unbearable. I cycled through the stages of grief at a dizzying speed. Denial, anger, a bargaining with a universe that wasn't listening, and finally, a deep, crushing depression. I had lost him. Not just the potential lover I had dared to imagine, but my best friend. The person I told everything to was the one person I couldn't talk to about this. On the 4th day, the anger solidified into something else, resolve. I was not going to let him do this. I was not going to let him destroy 15 years of friendship with his fear. I was not going to let him reduce that moment, our moment, to a mistake. He didn't get to detonate our world and then just walk away from the rubble. I put on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and walked out of my apartment with a grim sense of purpose. I drove to his place, the sleek, minimalist condo he'd bought with Clara and now rattled around in alone. The one he hadn't slept in for months. I had a key, one he'd given me ages ago for emergencies. This, I decided, qualified as an emergency. I let myself in, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air in the apartment was stale and cold. Mail was piled up by the door. The place had the sad, neglected feel of a museum after hours. I found him in the living room, sitting on a designer sofa that looked deeply uncomfortable, staring at a blank television screen. He was surrounded by the ghosts of a life he was supposed to have, and he looked smaller and more lost than I had ever seen him. He looked up as I entered, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and guilt. He looked terrible. He hadn't shaved, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Good, I thought with a flash of vindictive satisfaction. Let him be sleepless without me. Leo, he breathed, his voice hoarse. What are you doing here? What do you think I'm doing here? I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. You can't just kiss me, Julian, and then disappear. You don't get to do that. He flinched and looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I said I was sorry. Sorry for what? I demanded, walking closer to stand in front of him. Sorry for kissing me? Or sorry because you felt something you weren't prepared to feel, and now you're running away like a child? He squeezed his eyes shut. You don't understand. Then make me understand. I was practically shouting now, the frustration and hurt of the past few days boiling over. Talk to me. For once in your life, stop performing, stop hiding, and just talk to me. What the hell is going on in your head? My outburst seemed to break something in him. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. It was the same broken posture I had seen the night Clara left him, but this felt different. This wasn't about the collapse of an external world. It was the collapse of an internal one. I'm scared, he finally mumbled into his hands, the words so quiet I could barely hear them. Leo, I'm so scared. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with tears, and the anger drained out of me, replaced by that familiar, aching wave of tenderness. I've never. Not with a guy? I don't know what this is. When I kissed you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything with Clara ever did. And that terrifies me. He took a ragged breath. What does that make me? What am I supposed to do with that? All my life, I've had this plan. This picture of what my life was supposed to look like. A wife, kids, a house in the suburbs. And you don't fit in that picture. But you're the only thing that feels real. He finally confessed it all. He admitted that the jealousy had been real, a savage, possessive feeling that shocked him with its intensity. He admitted that his "we're just friends" line was a desperate attempt to shove his feelings back into a box they no longer fit in. He admitted that every night, when he'd roll over and pull me closer, he was half awake, consciously seeking my warmth, my presence, but using the excuse of sleep to absolve himself of the intent. Kissing me had been the first time he had done it while fully awake, fully conscious, and the reality of it, the undeniable truth of it, had sent him into a panic. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. I sank onto the couch beside him, the fight gone out of me. I listened as he unburdened himself of all the fear and confusion he'd been carrying. And when he was finished, when there was nothing left but a raw, exhausted silence, I finally spoke. You know, I said softly, you're not the only one who's been scared. I told him everything. I told him about the years I had spent loving him in silence, about the walls I had built, about my terror of losing our friendship. I told him how every casual touch from him was both a gift and a torment. I told him how his jealousy had confused and hurt me, and how his disappearance after the kiss had nearly broken me. I laid my own vulnerability bare, creating a space of mutual honesty. Your picture of the future, I said, looking around the cold, impersonal room. The one with the wife and the house. Was it making you happy, Julian? Or was it just the picture you thought you were supposed to want? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The answer was all around us. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine instantly, holding on like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. Maybe, I said, it's time to paint a new picture. Together. That conversation was not a magic wand. It didn't instantly solve everything or erase years of confusion and fear. But it was a foundation. It was the first solid piece of ground we had found to stand on. We didn't go back to my apartment that night. We stayed in that cold, sterile condo, and we talked until the sun came up. We talked about everything and nothing. We mapped out the geography of our shared history, re-examining moments through this new lens of honesty. There were no more secrets, no more coded language. For the first time, we were just Leo and Julian, two people trying to figure out how to move forward. He didn't kiss me again that night. The intimacy we shared was purely emotional, a careful, deliberate reconstruction of trust. When we finally fell asleep, it was on his uncomfortable designer sofa, exhausted but not touching, the space between us no longer a chasm of resentment but a quiet field of potential. The days that followed were a slow, careful dance of rediscovery. Julian started therapy. He began the difficult work of dismantling the expectations he had internalized his whole life and confronting the man he actually was, not the one he was supposed to be. He started spending nights at my apartment again, but it was different now. The pretense was gone. The first time he came back, he stood awkwardly in the doorway of my bedroom. "Can I?" he started, trailing off. I just smiled and pulled back the covers on his side of the bed. "This is your home too," I said. And this time, when we lay down, there was no calculated distance. He turned to face me immediately, and I opened my arms, and he settled against my chest, his head tucked under my chin, his sigh of relief a profound exhalation of years of tension. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. It was a conscious, deliberate act of seeking and giving comfort. We were learning a new language, one based on open affection and verbal reassurance. The jealousy didn't vanish overnight, but its expression changed. One evening, a few weeks later, I was on the phone with my sister, laughing about some old family story. I saw him watching me from the kitchen, and for a second, I saw the old shadow pass over his face. My stomach clenched in a familiar, anxious knot. But instead of withdrawing, instead of punishing me with silence, he walked over after I hung up, wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, and rested his chin on my shoulder. "I hate that I still feel this," he murmured into my ear, his voice quiet and laced with self-reproach. "That little twist in my gut when you're laughing with someone else. I'm working on it." It was an admission, not an accusation. It was him sharing his vulnerability instead of using it as a weapon. I turned in his arms and kissed him softly. "Thank you for telling me," I said. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. It was the proof that we were building something healthier, something strong enough to hold the weight of our insecurities. Our life slowly settled into a new rhythm, a quiet domesticity that was more profound and fulfilling than any grand romantic gesture. It was in the way he started making the coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. It was in the way I'd find him looking at the photos I'd taken of him sleeping, not with shame, but with a small, tender smile. He framed one of them and put it on his bedside table, the one at my apartment, which was now unequivocally our bedside table. His condo was eventually sold, its contents dispersed. He didn't need that ghost life anymore. The rituals that had once been steeped in ambiguity became our new normal, now open and cherished. Cuddling on the couch while watching a movie wasn't a prelude to a night of confusing boundaries. It was just us, being together. Sharing the bed wasn't a silent negotiation. It was our safe harbor, the place we came back to at the end of the day to find peace in each other's presence. The door to the bedroom was now closed, not to hide anything, but to create a private world that belonged only to us. One Sunday morning, I woke up to the smell of pancakes and the sound of Julian humming softly in the kitchen. The sun was pouring through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into a galaxy of tiny, glittering stars. I found him at the stove, flipping a pancake with a concentrated focus that was both serious and slightly comical. He was wearing an old t-shirt of mine and a pair of sweatpants, his hair a mess from sleep. He looked nothing like the polished corporate consultant or the golden boy athlete. He looked like my Julian. He looked like home. He glanced over his shoulder and saw me leaning against the doorframe, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was a smile that held no anxiety, no performance. It was pure, uncomplicated happiness. He didn't say anything. He just gestured with his spatula toward the table, where a plate was already waiting for me. In that simple, domestic moment, I saw the new picture we were painting. It wasn't the one with the picket fence or the prescribed roles. It was Messier, more complicated, and infinitely more beautiful. It was a picture filled with morning light, the smell of coffee, and the profound, quiet certainty of being exactly where you were supposed to be, with the person you were supposed to be with. We build our homes in the most unexpected of places. We think of home as a structure of wood and nails, a collection of rooms defined by walls and a roof. But sometimes, home is not a place at all. It's a person. It is the steady rhythm of their breathing in the dark. It is the safe harbor of their arms. It is the one place in the universe where the relentless noise of your own mind finally goes quiet. For years, Julian and I had orbited each other, trapped in a silence born of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of change, fear of a truth that didn't fit the map we'd been given. We used that silence to hide. But the beauty of our story, the quiet miracle of it, is that we learned to use it for something else. We transformed it. The silence between us was no longer an empty space of things unsaid. It became a vessel, a shared atmosphere rich with understanding and acceptance. We had found our way out of the anxious gray area and into the clear, warm light of honesty. And it was there, in the beautiful, peaceful silence we had learned to create together, that we finally found our way home.